leaders adopting a number of declarations, including on tackling human trafficking due to technology abuse, protection of migrant workers and their family, regional payment connectivity and promotion of local currency transactions, a One Health initiative, and adoption of the roadmap for Timor-Leste's full membership in ASEAN. Leaders welcomed ongoing efforts to strengthen cooperation between ASEAN and China and were encouraged by the progress of negotiations towards the early conclusion of an effective and substantive code of conduct in the South China Sea. And finally, the statement reiterated ASEAN's unified position that the 5-point consensus remains the main reference. Chandni Wadhwani, CNA, Labuan Bajo.
The tourism in Southeast Asia may soon return to its juggernaut status, shoring up the ASEAN region, which is battling export headwinds. The visitor arrivals have rebounded to 2/3 of pre-COVID levels.
Further momentum will depend very much on one country that used to top the charts. All this according to the latest research from the Bank of America. ASEAN's recovery has largely been driven by returning tourists from advanced economies and from within the region. The new wave is triggered by the easing of COVID measures globally since the start of last year.
The numbers have been rising steadily, arrivals recovering by more than 60% for most ASEAN countries. The revenue from tourists has not always been in tandem. For example, Malaysia saw arrivals rising more than 70%, but the increase in tourism spending was barely half of that. The hopes for further growth are now pinned on China. It used to be the top market for ASEAN's inbound travel industry. Now it's lagging behind the rest of North Asia.
Chinese visitor numbers have been climbing back up, nearly touching 30% of pre-COVID levels. There is optimism that the world's second most populous country will pick up pace. Here's why researchers are bullish. In March alone, Chinese arrivals into Singapore, Thailand and Vietnam recovered by up to 13 percentage points. That's more than double the February's. The number of outbound airline seats from China has rebooked to 45% of pre-COVID levels. It's clocking even faster rates for flights to ASEAN countries, as much as 64% for Singapore.
We are joined by Mohammed Faiz Al-Nabusa. He's an ASEAN economist at Bank of America Securities. Faiz, good morning. First of all, how does ASEAN's tourism recovery compare to the recovery in other regions around the world? And what's the time frame for a complete tourism revival in ASEAN?
Thank you for having us. ASEAN, I think, has recovered strongly since about middle of last year. We are roughly about 2/3 of the way into the tourism recovery, 2/3 of the 2019 levels. But this is still lagging the recovery of tourism into the advanced countries. For example, in Europe, the tourism has completely recovered. North America is close to 80 to 90%. So in that context, ASEAN is still lagging, but we are still leading ahead of the recovery of tourism into North Asia. In terms of timing, the final one-third is going to be the harder one. We see positive signs in terms of seat capacity recovering steadily, as you mentioned. But it's going to be over this year and next year. That's why in terms of the benefits of tourism, we think will most likely be coming, most of it will be coming through this year, but the remaining 10-20% will still happen into 2024.
And the return of tourism is an inevitable thing. Travel habits haven't changed, perhaps, post-pandemic.
We certainly hope so. I think it's one of the more unambiguous things that we are counting on. The signs are pointing towards people feeling the need to reconnect with families, friends, revisit places that they have been to. So I think the numbers will come back. What is less certain is whether the spending levels will come back, as you said. Will we get a higher spending because people haven't been on holidays for a long time? Or will we see lower spending because people are getting pinched on higher airfares? I think that's the one uncertainty that we are dealing with. And as for example, the Malaysia numbers show that numbers are back 70%, but spending is not nearly back close to that.
And Faiz, the recovery in Chinese outbound tourism seems to be picking up, but it's been a tepid start. What do you think's been holding Chinese tourists to venture abroad, and how long before their outbound travel recover to pre-COVID levels?
Yeah, that is the main hurdle for all of us. I think the key reason is that the seat capacity and the airline capacity is just not back to 100%. Going into the second and third quarter, it should only be back to 50% of pre-COVID levels. And thankfully, ASEAN is doing slightly better than that. But China is, working to reconnect in terms of getting the planes back, air crew back, but also the foreign airlines serving China, for example, a couple of our regional airlines, Thai Airways, for example, they have cut down on the flights to China. So the outbound capacity from China is also constrained at this point in time. So these things will take some time, and I think that's the main thing that is holding back. We don't think it is due to the fact that Chinese, consumers are less willing to spend. In fact, we estimate that China has a lot of excess savings accumulated during the pandemic that will be spent on various services, including tourism.
As happy as many countries will be to have visitors and their money returning, how wise is it to pursue an economic model so heavily dependent on tourism, given the pandemic and increasing extreme weather events? Are you seeing countries recalibrate in any way?
Not yet. I think not at this point in time. I think we see a lot of effort, at least in initiatives into ecotourism, green tourism. So people are aware of the costs, especially around the environment and certain tribal groups from tourism. But at this point in time, because tourism is one of the bright spots for the economic recovery, and we are living in a very gloomy economic environment with export downturn, recessions in the global economies, advanced economies, high interest rates. So I think tourism is, by and large, by governments, officials, as well as independent bodies, tourism is still being seen as one of the, definitive economic tailwinds over the, at least in the near term. But yeah, your questions are very real in the long term, I think.
Faiz, how much demand-related pressure would tourism recovery in ASEAN add on, consumer prices and services wages, and what sort of factors could offset those pressures?
Yeah, that's a small cost that we have to pay, especially for countries that have a large tourism sector, such as Thailand, Singapore, and to some extent Malaysia as well. That the tourism will, if tourists are returning to your country, they're going to spend money in food and beverage, in eating out, in dining out, in recreational services, visiting places. So that's going to keep price pressures relatively elevated. So inflation may not come off as quickly as policymakers are hoping for. So that's the cost of things. On the other hand, we can get some offset because airfares are still relatively elevated. We saw them going up, almost doubling relative to what they were pre-COVID because of airline capacity being constrained. But as capacity comes back, there could be some relief in terms of airfares. And to the extent the airfares are an important part of consumer prices, that they are in the case of Singapore, for example, that could provide a slight offset. But we still think, by and large, on net basis, the former, i.e. the return of the Chinese tourism or return of tourism in general, will create some kind of price pressures, even though airfares might be coming off.
Yeah, lower air flights fares will be welcome news for many, I'm sure. What lessons must the tourism industry learn from the last 3 years?
I think it's very important to make sure that we have what we did during the pandemic to provide financial support to the key airlines or key industries. Was very, very, very critical in making sure that they are still around in terms of gaining from the capacity that's coming back. But also it's important is a manpower issue. I think a lot of the countries are going to face some issues with getting manpower, whether it's air crew or hotel staff. It is a very labor-intensive sector, tourism, and therefore I think one of the key lessons to learn is to how we can increase the productivity, increase the adoption of technology in this sector that minimizes that reliance on labor, but also increases the wages of the individuals who are engaged in the sector as well. So we may not be able to serve as many people as we used to in terms of the workers who are working in tourism, but their per capita wage, can be higher if we adopt technological advances, technological, solutions that gives rise to higher productivity in the sector.
All right, Faiz, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your insight this morning. Mohammed Faiz Nagutha, ASEAN economist at the Bank of America Securities.
All right, we are headed for a short break now. Still ahead on Asia First.
New York City is bracing for a surge in migrant arrivals as the Biden administration ends its Title 42 border restrictions. I'm Sally Patterson, and I'll have that story for you in just a few minutes.
This Saturday, what does a pause in interest rate hikes mean for investors? maintaining diversification is important, with an overweight to bonds and also to gold.
Will Singapore rents continue to break records?
High rents don't necessarily affect the incoming foreigners. The high rents affect the locals.
Can artificial intelligence help you invest better?
It does some things very well, but what it's missing is potentially very dangerous.
Money Mind, Saturday at 10:30 p.m.
As Malaysia continues its fight against COVID-19, families had to overcome significant barriers to see their loved ones again. I'm Afifa Arvin, CNA, Johor.
The PLA Navy is making tremendous and impressive progress.
把这个科技技术掌握在自己手中，这代表着我们把核心的供应链掌握在自己手中。
And the goal over the next 5 years is to continue this extension of nuclear power with a rhythm of about 6 to 8 nuclear power unit generations approved every year.
这是我们连第一次和美军正面交锋。
朝鲜战争的题材以前是不敢拍的，那么现在很清楚。
This May, traverse from the high octane of Asia's urbanisation to the calm realm of its natural wonder. Journalist John Lee rediscovers her roots in the world's K-pop capital and examines how the city continues to evolve.
There's this tension of old and new.
Deciphering South Korea, a rich and diverse world of outstanding wildlife in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Singapore Botanic Gardens, like you've never seen it before. 1 year in the gardens. A world without elephants or turtles. Who are the trailblazing environmentalists making it their life's mission to save these species? The mass extinction. This May on CNA.
From brokering a Saudi-Iran truce to working to resolve the Russian-Ukraine war, China wants to fill the role of global mediator, but with a bellicose stance in its own backyard and an ever-increasing military buildup. Are China's peacemaking ambitions credible? Join us for a forum special on China, the Peacemaker. Insight, Thursday on CNA.
Welcome back. The chaos and confusion along the U.S.-Mexico border ahead of the expiration of the controversial pandemic-era immigration policy, also known as Title 42.
That policy allows officials to expel migrants arriving at the southern border by citing public health risks.